Hello, my name is Todd Miranda, and the purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate how to express more complex logic using just triggers in WPF. Let's begin by creating a new WPF Windows application project, and we'll call this Complex Triggers. And we're going to, in this demonstration, combine not only property triggers, but data triggers. And then we're going to use a new trigger construct called multi-trigger and multi-data trigger. And we're going to combine all this together. So the first thing that we're going to need is to add a data file to our project so that we can bind to some data. And I have an XML file that is a list of members that we can use for this. So we'll add this data file to our project and take a look at that data. So here you can see we've got a list of members. Each member element has an isActive, a group color, and a name. isActive indicating obviously if they're active or not. Group color is the indication of the group that they're in, and then their particular name. So this should give us enough data to work with for this particular demonstration. So to begin with, let's create our window.resources block, and in our window resources block we'll create an XML data provider. We'll specify the source is the XML file that we just added, and we'll give it a key so that we can reference it later in code, and we'll just call this members list. And there it is. That's all there is to it, to creating our XML data provider. Now let's go down in our grid, and for this example we want to list all of the members that are part of our data set, or our XML file in this case, but we don't really want to use a list box or anything where the user can select one of those users. The selection is not necessary, so instead of a list box we'll use an items control. The items control is just a generic control that allows you to list items. So we're going to specify that this items control's item source is our binding source static resource members list. And since this is an XML file, we're going to tell the items source, or the list control, where to start pulling its elements from. So in order to do that, we're going to specify an XPath, and we're going to say we want to go down from the root through the members to the actual member elements. Okay. And in our items control, we're going to create a template so we can lay out how we want our items to be displayed. So we'll do items control dot item template, and our item template is a data template. Now if you use Visual Studio 2005 and you have the WinFX plugin for Visual Studio 2005, the extensions, you'll notice that the IntelliSense is not exactly right all the time. So one of the things that I like to do inside an item template, since data template does not show up but data template key does, is I'll just use data template key, backspace over the key, and be able to use the data template a little bit more quickly. So that way I still can use IntelliSense to move a little bit more quickly through my coding without data template actually being there. And you'll notice that we still get the squiggly lines here because it's just not included under item template. So we're going to create a data template, but another trick that I like to do when I'm trying to do something really fast and quick using IntelliSense here is, once we're inside our data template block, we lose some of our IntelliSense. So we're going to come right here beneath our items control, and we're going to build our data template here. That way we can take advantage of the IntelliSense while we're building our template, and then move it into the actual data template block. So let's start with a text block, and this text block, its text value will be set to a binding expression, and since we're dealing with XML again, we're going to use the XPath, and we'll specify an XPath of name, which will pull the name right out of the member element. and we want to specify some style for our text block. So we'll specify a style block, and in that style block we'll have a style with a target type of text block. And in that style, the first thing we'll do is we'll set some default values. So we'll set the default foreground for our text to green. Now, we're also going to have some triggers, but we want more than just the standard trigger. We want some more complex logic built in. So the first thing we want to do is trigger off of our data, and we're going to create a pause. We're going to create a trigger block. So we'll create our trigger block. And the first thing that we're going to put in our trigger block is a data trigger. This is just a simple data trigger. We're going to specify its binding to be binding XPath equals is active. We're going to check the is active flag, and we're going to see if the value for that is active flag is false. If it is, we'll set the foreground to red. Okay, so this is just a simple data trigger. We've probably seen these before. We're looking at the isActive property of what we're bound to. If its value is false, we'll set the foreground to red. So now let's add some more complex trigger logic. We've seen these simple triggers before. Let's take a look at let's say a multi-data trigger. So we'll do a multi-data trigger, and that multi-data trigger has a set of conditions. So we'll create a condition block, and then we've got one or more conditions. So in this case, we're going to do, since this is a data trigger, we're going to use the binding, and we'll say our binding is to XPath is active, and that value is false. Then we've got another condition, and remember, since this is a multi-data trigger, this effectively acts like an AND. So both of these conditions have to be true in order for our setter in our multi-data trigger to be fired. So we'll also look in here, and we're going to look at the name. And as much as I hate picking on anybody, we'll go up here and let's find somebody that has a false active flag, grab their name, and paste the name there. So if isActive is false and the name is Stacy Foothart, sorry Stacy, we'll create a setter for our property, and this time we'll set the background to something that will stand out, something like aqua. Okay, so we've created a multi-data trigger. It has multiple conditions. In our case, we have two conditions. We're looking for the isActive property to be false and the name property to be Stacy Foothart. Or in our case, since this is XML, the isActive attribute and the name attribute. So, or elements in that case. Now, what do we have so far? So far, we've got a default foreground of green. We've got a simple data trigger that sets the foreground to red for anything that is not active. We have also another data trigger that conditions on the isActive being false and the name being a particular name, and that sets the background to aqua. Let's take a look at just a property multi-trigger. So let's add not a multi-data trigger, let's add a multi-trigger, and we're going to create the multi-trigger.conditions, and we're going to do a condition. And this time we're going to set property, because we're doing property triggers in our standard multi-trigger. And this time we're going to say that if the foreground is green, all right, so if you see here, what we're doing, we're triggering off of a property that may have been set in a previous trigger, because the triggers are handled top down. This trigger will have fired first, setting the foreground to red for anything that's not active. So effectively what we're doing with this particular condition is saying that if it's not active, which we could use in a way, we could find out if it's active using properties, but we're going to use the foreground color. If it's active, that means that the foreground is green. We're going to do something. We're going to add one additional condition. We're going to say is mouse over, and value equals true. And if both of those conditions are met, then we'll create a setter. Property will be background, and value will be yellow. So the interesting points here obviously are we've got these multi-triggers that we can use that contain multiple conditions. A multi-trigger acts like an AND, so both of these conditions have to be true before our setters are put into place. And not only do we have these multiple multi-triggers, we got a multi-data trigger and a multi-trigger, but we're actually triggering in one of our later triggers on a property that might have been set by a previous trigger. And we can do that because the triggers are applied top down. So the last thing that we have to do now is take our text block that we pulled out so that we could create our data template with some IntelliSense and paste it into our data template block of our item template. So we can use that text block as our data template, and now we'll run our application and see what this looks like. So the first thing to note is that we have some items that are green, some items that are red, and this particular item has a background of aqua because this is our multi-data trigger. It's is active as false, and the name is Stacy Foothart. And you'll note that as I hover over now, the items that are green, so that means their foreground is green, and I'm doing an is mouse over equals true, their background is being set to yellow. So as you can see, using multi-triggers and multi-data triggers, and then being very careful in what order we set our triggers and what kind of conditions we use to set our triggers, we can do some very complex logic using just triggers without having to write any procedural code.